This week, I was in the mood to build a Royal Guard helmet. It was one of those projects that sounded like a bit of a fun break, seeing as I could probably complete the entire thing in only a couple of days. First thing to do was getting the parts 3D printed. As you can probably tell, these helmets are much larger than your typical Stormtrooper or Mandalorian. Split in half like this, you practically have a normal helmet and then this entire additional neck piece. I decided to use my Creality K2 Plus for this large bottom section. Been a while since I've used this printer and wanted to give it another go. I of course use ABS for these pieces, my go-to for prop builds, and 21 hours later I had a finished print. Next was the second part of this helmet, the top. I used a trick I've been doing on all of my helmet prints lately, which is where I do some variable layer height painting right at the top of the dome to make it print cleaner. The smaller layers create a smoother curve, so you don't have quite as many noticeable layer steps on top that you have to work at sanding down later. It also tends to help the inside print cleaner, since I rarely use support material for the inside of domes. It's just not necessary for a successful print and will save you on time and filament. Once I had the two pieces printed, it was on to post-processing, which is what the majority of time spent on this project is going to be. First was removing the support material. It came off way easier than I was expecting, given how steep some of these overhangs are. I always like printing ABS with a 0.1mm support separation because I find that 0.2mm tends to be too much and can cause the prints to turn out rough and misshapen. But that also sometimes means that the support material likes sticking a little too well in areas and needs a little extra help. So after a bit of filing around where the visor will end up going, it was on to the first round of sanding with, you guessed it, the trusted foot sander. I thought we'd maybe reach the point of everyone getting sick of me talking about this thing, but I still get questions all of the time about it. So yes, this is a human foot sander or electric callus remover, which I would never use for its intended purpose unless it was like on droid feet, but it is by far my preferred way to sand 3D prints, especially for the initial sand. In fact, it's like the only time I ever use it is on the raw plastic, and I do a really thorough job with this thing. I think I spent like an hour sanding down this entire helmet piece. It is quite a large helmet anyway, but I also make sure to do a really thorough job to try and save myself as much hand sanding later on, with the exception of maybe a few problem areas, and also in this case the seam that's going to be between the two pieces. I normally can get this thing smooth enough that with a couple of rounds of filler primer it's like good to go. Once I had those parts thoroughly sanded, it was on to attaching them, and for this, since these pieces are ABS, I just used some acetone. I then grabbed my ABS slurry mixture, which is support material that's being dissolved in some acetone to make it thicker to help me fill in things like seam lines. I unfortunately have no ratio to tell you for this because support material is so different depending on what it's come from, but generally you don't want it to be too thick because if you do, it kind of will just continuously stay gummy and never really dry. It will also most likely get thicker over time as your acetone evaporates, so you might need to add more acetone back into whatever jar you might have it mixed up in. But the nice thing about this is it sands down just as easily as ABS does, so my hope here was that I could sand out this seam line down enough to hopefully completely blend it into itself. After sanding it down here, I probably could have done another round of it and it would have achieved that goal, but I didn't and just went right ahead with painting it to see how good or bad of a job I did with making this seam line disappear. I then threw together the tallest helmet stand that I think I've ever seen in my life. This was my modular, fully 3D printed one. I will link it below if you'd like to print your own, but it meant that I could just add more pole segments to the height that I needed for this absolutely ginormous helmet. I added even a few more than I probably needed to so that it was a bit taller so I didn't have to kill my back spraying this thing. And I did my usual 2 generous coats of filler primer before letting it dry and continuing on with the post-processing, which yes, does unfortunately involve even more sanding. I mostly concentrated the sanding around where that seam line was, since that was still the biggest issue. Honestly, the rest of the helmet was looking pretty great. So 180 grit around the seam line, and then I went in with some of my UV resin mixture. This is some 3D printer resin mixed in this case, with cornstarch. I was trying out the cornstarch for once, but you can also use baby powder I've done before, fumed silica. Depending on what you mix in, it does change how easy it is to sand, which is why I was testing out the cornstarch this time around. I still don't feel like I've used it enough to give you my final thoughts on it, but it did seem to sand pretty well. Definitely a lot easier than the fumed silica. So yeah, I guess let me know what your preferred mix-in is for your resin filler if you've found one that sands a lot easier than the others. Probably should have started by mentioning that the powder is to make the UV resin thicker, since normally UV resin resin is like water thin and will just get everywhere unless you add something to it. But yeah, just applied a couple of layers of that around the entirety of the seam line on this helmet and then intermittently cured it with a handheld UV light. And once I felt I'd built up enough of a coating around the whole helmet, it was on to, you guessed it, even more sanding. Listen, I know sometimes it feels like 50% of my YouTube channel is just sanding down 3D printed parts, but in this particular helmet's case, you do really need a flawless base to paint on top of. It's very much like the Mandalorian's helmet in that way. The paint job is very simple, but in order to get the paint job looking as good as it needs to, you need to spend a lot of time on the sanding and post-processing. Thankfully, after that round of filler priming, I felt that this base was good to go, so I finished it off with a round of 400 grit sanding, mostly just to remove any possible overspray from paint so that it's really smooth to then start adding paint on top of. And for the paint, I went with this satin apple red color. I would have normally gone for a matte because I was planning on adding a glossy coat on top of this anyway, but satin was as close as I could get. I just find that the glossier you go with spray paint, the more likely it is to want to drip run and just cause you grief, which at this stage of the helmet I was not willing to risk. So I did a couple of finer, more careful coats of this paint. Not that it really looks like it on camera because this stuff has really great coverage, but I'm happy to say that I was successful in not ruining this paint job with paint drips or any other unfortunate accidents. Once I let the red paint thoroughly dry, it was on to adding the gloss coat, and for this I went with this Montana Gold varnish. It's one of the only spray cans that I found that the gloss doesn't remain tacky in any way, and it also just really looks great. You apply it very similarly to how you do 2K clear, which is where you do multiple layers really quickly, like before the previous layer even dries, so like 2 minutes in between coats maybe. And in the end, you are typically left with a really impressive glossy finish. The last part to finish up this helmet is the visor. There's a model of it included in the files that I decided to print out to use as a template. I printed it in some random PLA that I then used my heat gun on to flatten the piece out. Normally I just template the visor myself with some painter's tape and cardstock, but the visor was so far up into the helmet and I forgot to do any of this before I got the entire helmet finished, so I figured it was probably my safest bet to do it this way without, accidentally ruining the entire helmet. I traced the template onto a piece of welding visor and then cut it out with some scissors, making sure to cut inside the line so that the final cut visor was the same size as the template. For now, I just had to pop it into place, which it did fit absolutely perfectly, thankfully. The gloss coat still seemed a little delicate when I got to this point, so I didn't want to be handling the helmet too much, but eventually I will properly glue it in. And here's the finished Imperial Royal Guard helmet. In total, it took me about a day to 3D print all of the parts, and then I worked on it over a couple of afternoons, so if you had the pieces already printed, this is definitely a doable weekend project, and a fun one if you don't want to be taking on something with a really intense painting job, or maybe want to work on your post-processing routine. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.